great to have you here. I know it's not easy after lunch. I just consumed another coffee to help get me through. My name's Helen Brown. I'm your MC for this event. My startup company, which is called Business Asia, we do a lot of work around cultural competency skills when going into a new market. And of course, one of the key markets we have to be mindful of is China. Given the size of the market and its complexity, there are many elements of it that we need to understand. And one of the elements that we need to understand is around building your brand. And that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon with a fantastic panel that we've lined up for you. This also gives you an opportunity to ask panellists. The panellists involves some questions, and you can do that after. We'll indicate when that's possible, but there'll be some roving mics through the room. But if you also have your Global Table app connected, you can ask a question through that app. If you go into the schedule and then go into the session that we're on right now, there's a chance where you can just write in the question that you would like to ask. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you now to the moderator for this panel. It's Nick Henderson from Asialink Business. And if Nick will be joined on stage shortly by the panellists as well. But please remember, have some questions ready because it's a great opportunity for you to ask some key people about building your brand in China.
I'm going to the wrong place. Good afternoon, everybody. How was everybody's lunch break? Very good. Did you have a chance to have a St. Ellie's coffee? Anybody? Some great Melbourne coffee on offer here and some fantastic food. So I'm sure if you haven't had a chance to have something to eat, there's plenty more after this session. And good afternoon, gentlemen. This is our panel, and good afternoon, everyone here. And our panel today is titled Succeeding in China. That's a big topic in itself. How to build an Australian brand that stands out. So the China market, as many people know, is a market with big numbers. 1.3 billion people, 300 million plus middle class consumers, but a very competitive marketplace, probably one of the most competitive consumer markets in the world. So within that brand or that market context, how does a brand stand out? And how do we as Australian brands, indeed, how do we capture the hearts and minds of Chinese consumers? How do we create relevance, which is a very brand kind of marketing concept, which we'll probably talk a little bit more about in a moment. Today we're really lucky to have some of the industry's leading consultants, advisors, commissioners who are actually on the ground in China and throughout the region, talking to customers all the time and dealing with the market, who are able to share their insights. So we're going to have a conversation. It's not going to be me up here talking about brand like this. It's not going to be any of us talking specifically on one topic for this whole panel. The idea is for us to have a conversation. We have time at the end for your questions, and it's really designed to be a dialogue. Just if I may start off, and I will introduce our panellists very shortly. My name is Nick Henderson. I'm the Director of the China Practice and Business Events at Asialink Business, which is the National Centre for Asia Capabilities. I was very fortunate to spend 17 years in China up to 2014 and did have a brief foray running a brand strategy firm called Future Brand. Now, I know many of the gentlemen on the stage here from that time, but let me just say this. The market from 2014 to 2019 has changed a lot. So there is this concept of China speed. And when it comes to marketing, when it comes to brand, there is nothing more constant in China than change. And so today we've got people who are in the market, who are going to be flying back into market literally in the next couple of days, and are here to give you fresh insights, ideas, but very much rooted in the context of the market. So without further ado, and without me going on and boring you, and you'll need a coffee after this, I'm going to introduce some of my fellow panellists whom I've had the pleasure to have worked with, to have had meals and conversations with over the years. To my left is a good friend, Matthew Mckenzie. Matthew is a market development specialist with over 20 years of beverage brand experience, currently working for Bright Foods Shanghai, and we'll get Matthew to introduce what he's been doing, but spent many years in China building brands, creating a difference and I guess a point of difference for brands, Aussie brands in Australia. And Matt will talk a little bit about that just in a moment. Next to him is Andrew Kuiler, founder and CEO of a great business called the Silk Initiative, China's only specialised food and beverage insights brand-driven consultancy, from innovation through to design. So I'll get Andrew in a moment to introduce himself and what he does in his funky studio in Shanghai. Next to him is Nicholas Sims, founder and managing director of NCS Enterprises, previous CEO of Bubs, and spent significant amount of time in China. So Nick, I'll get him to introduce himself in a moment. And last but not least is Brent Moore, Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner to Shanghai, soon to be over-based in Taipei, has spent 15 years in the public and private sector, and very much involved in a number of the free trade agreements which we all share the benefits of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go left, and I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes just to briefly introduce themselves, and I guess your particular element of brand that you focus on, and then we'll get stuck into some questions. So, Matt, over to you.
Well, that's on, yep. Thank you for the introduction, Nick. So my name is Matthew Mckenzie. I'm the General Manager Marketing in Asia for the Bright Food Group. For those that aren't aware, Bright Food is actually an extremely large Chinese-owned business. It's owned by the Shanghai government, so it's an SOE. We have roughly $20 billion of revenue in China. We're one of the larger dairy companies. We own a number of retail chains in eastern China. And the division in which I work is one of the international arms of the business. And essentially we import and distribute a number of world-famous brands across China. So we're the lead distributor for Wrigley Mars in China. We're their largest partner. We work with companies like Henderson, which is a Danish butter cookie company, which was owned by Campbell Soup, has now been bought by the Italian group Ferrero. We represent Ferrero across the market. So
they're a big company, aren't they?
They're a very large company. So we work with a range of businesses. We also have companies down here in Australia. So we're the largest citrus exporter out of Australia into China. So, we are essentially looking to partner with Australian brands that are interested in building a strong presence in China. It was interesting listening to Mark Tanner's talk earlier this morning, where he mentioned that around 10% of FMCG sales in China are online. And what that says to me is that's a huge market opportunity, but that means that 90% of FMCG sales are in other channels and across general trade in the market, and that's where our strength is in building distribution. But you can't build distribution unless you've got a strong brand, a strong story, and strong support behind the product. So I guess that's what we do. Anyone that's interested in coming into China, I'm happy to have a chat after the talk.
Thank you, Matthew. I'll now pass over to Andrew Kuiler.
Kuiler.
Sorry, mate.
It's all right. Story of my life. So my name's Andrew Kuiler. I am originally from Ballarat in Victoria, down the road. and have been in China for 13 years now. Spent a good chunk in New York as well. Had my agency for about 4.5 years. We started out as primarily an insights agency. That was my background for a good part of 20 years. But I wanted to make stuff. And when the free trade agreement came around with China, I thought that could be my shtick. I've got a marketing background, a major in Chinese, been in China for a while. But I saw the free trade agreement as an opportunity to help create opportunities. In that time, I've seen the work kind of transcend from like market discovery and go-to-market type consulting gigs now into pretty grown up strategic pieces, and that's a big focus for us. So we look at, what could be the next strategic growth platforms, either from a messaging point of view, a new channel point of view, product particularly, so the tactile experience, and then how do we lean on our insights backgrounds in our team to essentially produce assets. So product lines, the substrates for different channels. We go all the way through pack design. We also write creative briefs and also getting into the brand plan piece for clients. It's been quite nice in the last, I'd say, year and a half that we're seeing the Australian, New Zealand folks getting a bit more grown up in what they're doing, and we're having a lot of fun doing it. Certainly the scales are proof of that in the last 10 years of being in China. But we've worked with a lot of Australian brands. The most notable would probably like A2, creating different sort of opportunities for them, the Sunrises of the world, Simplot, Buller and so forth. And now starting to take some of those wellness platforms that Australia does so well into the consumer healthcare space as well, which is pretty exciting. So pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'll now pass over to Nicholas Sims. And Nicholas, do you mind if I call you Nick? It's fine. Fantastic. Nick, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a couple of minutes of introduction and your engagement with brands in China. Thank you. Sure.
Hi everyone, my name's Nicholas Sims, or Nick Sims. I'm the founding managing director of a company called NCS Enterprises, which is a boutique advisory and investment house which specialises in consumer goods. In a previous life, I've been in consumer goods for 30 years, Mars organisation, Heinz, and then was involved with growing smaller brands. So I ran a business called 5am Organics, which we built and exited at a trade sale to a multinational, and then most recently as the CEO listing Bubs Australia, transforming it from a small privately owned enterprise into a ASX top 500 business with a real focus on China. For me, I really like working on businesses and opportunities of brands that I think are really truly better, that actually have a point of difference, and I think we'll get into it obviously further in the conversation how important that is when you start to look at international markets and understanding what those are. But that's really what inspires me, and there are lots of great businesses that have wonderful opportunities, and I think it's... but there's also a very big graveyard of businesses that have become impatient or got it wrong, and I think it's important to sort of be able to share with the broader community within our fast-moving consumer goods industry about how can you potentially not make some of those mistakes along your own journeys as well.
Thank you very much, Nick. I think the key point there is building a brand, creating an engagement with the consumer is a journey. So I'll now pass it over to Brent for his brief introduction.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And for those who don't know me, my name is Brent Moore, and I've been in Shanghai as Trade Commissioner, working mostly on food, bev, agriculture and e-commerce for 6 years. That really started out in 2014 as we're sort of coming into the final stages and the final push towards concluding a free trade agreement. One of the key initiatives we did at the time was Australia Week, and had the pleasure of looking after about 800 odd Australian businesses as they marched their way through about 20 cities across China.
It was an experience, wasn't it?
Complete unforgettable experience, that's right. But a takeaway from that experience, of course, we had, if you counted up the food and the agriculture companies together, they accounted for around 2/3 of all the Australian companies on that mission, and by far and away the largest sector. So food and ag obviously is extremely important, both to Chinese consumers and to Australian SMEs in Victoria. And the role we play is we're really like a first port of call to come and seek advice, see what's going on in trends, find some referrals to other partners, and start a journey towards finding a distributor who might be a good match for that product. And a part of that can be advice from our team of food and bev. We've got 12 across China that would say, this product might not meet China's regulatory requirements. Have you considered another channel? And over the course of sort of 6 years, we've put a lot of that advice into writing, which is freely available on the Austrade website. We've published 2 quite comprehensive guides, one on e-commerce and one on exporting food and bev. And they're available free of charge to anyone here who's on that path to discovering what they might or might not be able to do in China.
If I can just add to that, please download that. It's a great resource. Brent, there is also one coming out in the next month, which is Southeast Asia e-commerce as well, which you may also want to consider just to provide some background information about that ecosystem. So thank you very much. We've now done our introductions. I'm just going to quickly ask some questions, and you can answer, or you're happy if you don't as well. How many businesses here or organisations or people are currently exporting and have a brand in the Chinese market? Can I just get some hands? Fantastic, thank you. How many are currently in the stage of consideration? Okay, so we've got a few there. How many are part of the support ecosystem that actually provides insight support to those businesses looking to go into China? Okay, we have some there. How many are consumers? Great. Glad to see we've got consumers here as well. Fantastic. That's great, because we've just done a bit of a temperature check of who's here so that we can focus what we're going to be talking about next. And what we thought, we had a bit of a discussion over lunch, and we kind of thought breaking this up a little bit into brand, consumer, brand, market, brand, key success factors, and some key takeaways might be a good way to structure what we talk about. And so what I think we'll do, if it's okay with everyone, we're having a fluid conversation. I may ask a few questions related to those topics, and we'll just see who wants to respond, and we will have time at the end for your questions as well. So if I can start off with a question to everybody, what is the Chinese consumer? We're talking about Chinese consumer. It's a broad generic topic as well, but what is the general relationship that a Chinese consumer has with a brand? Anybody like to start on that one?
From my point of view, brands belong to consumers.
Okay.
I used to find it interesting. I'd go to investor days around dairy, and Fonterra and the like would talk about how they're attached to a global pricing system where we actually established our price. We're a brand. It belongs to the consumer. The consumer value proposition was strong enough that they would accept that, and it actually was in line with their values, and they would support that. And I think that is true the world over. So I think it's really, brands are about, understanding your tribe, no matter where they are, and really providing that safety and surety time and time again, no matter where the consumer wants to interact with you.
Fantastic. Anybody else? Andrew?
I'd say the emotional connection that brands have with Chinese consumers is still relatively in its infancy. Certainly, we don't get emotional attachments to brands at the same level as you may in the West. It is changing. And so when we're doing research development around brand strategy, we talk about positioning, we talk about hero occasions, consumption occasions, we talk about job roles, we talk about brand purpose and mission. All of our global big brands struggle with fulfilling those two bottom buckets. The key sort of thing is just like job role. How does it fit in with sort of the life stage, the day part, that's all moving pretty quickly, as Mark Tanner was talking this morning about some of the key trends in China. They change so fluidly, and this is one of the issues we have still in China. Consumers are still hopping around brands. So the ability for a brand to establish the same level of saliency over time as it would in, say, the Australian market isn't there. So that's one of the key challenges, I would say. Right now, we're still in the stage of, like, it has to play a very specific purpose in a job role. But as far as an emotional connection, that's the sort of jury's still out on that. And that does have implications all the way through to things like media and trade spend, which is probably where a lot of Australian companies get it wrong in the misallocation of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other... Matt, would you like to share some insights?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting listening to what Andrew had to say, because I completely agree. And I think that the journey for a lot of international brands, obviously it's a long game. You've got to play the long game.
Yep.
You've got to have your strategy set. You've got to stick to your strategy, and you've really got to build those key pillars. What's been interesting for me now, stepping into a Chinese company that's extremely well established and is a household name within China, is a lot of people that I talk to, both in China as well as here in Australia, when I say who I'm working for, they want to tell me stories about their attachment to the brand and when they were a child. And Guangming is it's a household name across China, and particularly back in the days when a lot of people, I guess, from my generation were growing up in China, they didn't have access to so many products, and they've got a special connection to the brand that I'm now working with. So what that suggests to me is that for international brands, if they play the long game and they play the long game well, and things go well for them, there is the long-term potential for them to create that resonance with the consumer in China.
All right. I may just pause there for a second. Who here is a consumer of Guangming Niaonai? Guangming milk. Okay, great. Do you mind just shouting out to us, what does Guangming mean to you? Childhood memories. Okay.
Emotional attachment to the brand.
Emotional attachment. So thank you very much. How can Australian brands, when we're talking about connecting to the consumer, create that relevance, and what role does Brand Australia play in that? I might just go over to you, Brent, to maybe start on that one.
I mean, obviously for government we look at branding from a very different perspective, and we're looking at a much higher level. And to Andrew's earlier point about branding being something very emotional, that does actually work very, very well for the national brand. And the clearest example of that is when you get off the plane on your first visit to Australia, and there's more than 1 million short-term visitors coming to Australia from China every year. You've got 180,000 people studying here. Once you go through customs and quarantine, for example, you get to meet our sniffer dogs, and while you might think that's all very novel and quite interesting, immediately it tells you from the very first impression that you have of this country is we protect our natural resources, and that builds and reinforces the image amongst those consumers who become our ambassadors and advocates that Australia is a pristine, pure country. And then when you're driving, from Tullamarine into town, you're looking up, it's blue sky, it's green. That has a very deep emotional impact on people, and they really like Australian products. I think that sets up a good foundation for companies to execute and follow up on.
Fantastic. Very good. Andrew, did you have a further comment on that?
Yeah, the dairy point. So I was in a workshop on Monday, and we did an introduction of brand campaigns from Chinese dairies, Australian dairies, dairy brands, New Zealand dairy brands. If you just look at the split between the two, if you look at Fonterra's campaigns, if you look at A2's campaigns, you still see a high regard in messaging around functionality, better science, safety, guardianship, ingredients, supply chain. If you look at the Chinese ads, for the Chinese dairies, sorry, you're going to hate me for this, but we can help you on this, is that a huge shift to highly emotional campaigns, long campaigns, almost infomercials. really pulling at the heartstrings of the Chinese consumer, the guy driving his motorbike through the countryside, exploring his life. It's like an e-league campaign.
Yeah.
Mungyo's doing the same thing because they don't have a lot to grab. They're sort of kind of clutching at straws when it comes to what's really on the consumer's mind, paramount in dairy, safety, taste delivery. So we're seeing this sort of split right now with China. I can see a lot of Chinese ad agencies going like, let's really sort of just amp up these emotional heartstrings. And they get the local consumer, so they know how to do it. They know how to do it with a nuance and a language that the Chinese consumer gets, and Australian brands don't. So that is a big challenge right now we're at in the market, I think.
A very, very relevant point. So we hear in the Chinese market about clean and green, made in Australia. Is that still getting the cut through in order for businesses to get that compelling brand proposition? Is that still resonating, or is that becoming a must-have for Australian companies going to the market? Anybody like to... Nick, would you like to... And then Brent?
I might have the first go at that. Look, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
It's an advantage that I think many other countries, probably other than New Zealand, would love to have. That connotation's probably not there with the US. Europe, less so. Then the rest of the world kind of forget it. So we do have this great advantage to start with. But it can breed a little bit of complacency, I think. I think you shouldn't not forget the fundamentals of doing promotions, advertising, merchandising in store. I think it's very easy to get that first sale. You go to a trade show, someone gives you a business card, you could be trading in a month. That's not necessarily a longer-term business that is about, putting your roots down in China. Now, if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. But if you want to be a big, serious business and you want China to be a part of that, it takes more than just saying you're clean and green.
Thanks, Brent. And Nick, if you'd like to make some follow-up comments.
I don't want to be too controversial, but in regards to...
I think we don't mind controversial, do we?
Clean and green, I'm actually, we rest on that far too much. The reality is we take it for granted, and we think that we can actually import ingredients from somewhere else in the world, pack them here, and because we're an Australian company, be able to sell it to China and feel good about that, and that we should be successful. Like it's an educated consumer who has access to huge amounts of information through their mobile phone. They are ravenous when it comes to the consumption and education of what a brand can and should be and what it stands for. And so I actually think you need to be more than clean and green. I think that's a point that we've got to move on from.
And I think, Andrew, I'll get you to comment in just 1 second. I think because we are looking 6 months, 1 year, 5 years down the track, we need to be looking ahead of the market, right? So if now clean and green is what is really relevant to the consumer, we need to be looking ahead. The market's a little bit soft at the moment. We need to be looking at when things start to grow and when those second, third tier markets start to mature. Of course, that is happening now, but we need to be thinking in a longer time horizon as well. So really relevant point. Andrew.
So going back to the point before, it changes so fast that brands can hardly keep up with it. So we did an audit about a year and a half ago. Many of our global clients, the number one thing that keeps them up at night is how and why are local brands winning? What are their strategies? What can we do to keep up? Is clean and green still relevant? So we decided to embark on tracking that specific question every month with big data. We've invested very heavily in that and built a platform, a dynamic tool to answer that, because I kind of get tired of that question. I'm going to rip my eyes out with a blunt spoon if I get asked it again. But literally, it's changing so much. If I started to look into the data last week with the team, we're seeing a split. First-tier cities have moved on. The number 2 the top two priorities in terms of what they want from the future of food, regardless of whether it's from Australian brands or US brands: hyper-personalisation, tailored to my needs, fits into my health and wellness regime. These are like the top three. If you do the flip side and you look at the data in emergent cities, tier 2, 3, 4, 5, totally different. It is made to global standards. I want to trust the supply chain, has to be safe. So now the answer comes, have we sort of, has the ship sailed? Has a boat left the dock? For first tier cities where it tends sometimes to be easier to do business, where most Australian clients feel comfortable going to Shanghai, and then to take that particular message into other cities, which, Matthew, have huge populations.
Yes.
In terms of size of prize. So I think the thing is, if you're really serious about that particular topic and you think that your whole brand and your whole business strategy is wrapped around clean and green, you better start looking at the market changing every month and whether you can keep up with that.
I agree, and it is, you need to keep close to the market because the consumer changes, the competitive set changes very quickly, and the regulatory environment changes.
Yeah, and I would say, to me, clean and green is something that, being based here in the food industry, food and beverage industry from Australia, it's a mandatory. I mean, it's just something that we benefit from. I think that the Australian government, Austrade, and the team up in China do a great job at getting that message out there. I think tourism also helps to build that message. As someone who, I was in China for the last 4 years and now based in Hong Kong, every time I come down here and look out the window, I get reminded of how blue the sky is, how green the grass is, and just how pristine this country is. But there are other players in that space. So if your pricing is not, if your pricing is incorrect, or if your product is the wrong size, or if you can't get through regulatory barriers, you can't access the market. So to me, clean and green is not something to rest your hat on.
Yep.
It's just something to embrace and potentially have as part of your messaging. But it's not. It shouldn't really be a key pillar of a new brand in China.
Okay, that's really relevant. I'm just going to ask one question. I think this came up from what was said. You were talking about, someone mentioned about the story. So if we are talking clean and green, how do we link that to our brand story? And then how do we add the Australia element to it, and how do we create cut through to the consumer? Anybody like to take that? Perhaps Brent, you.
I have a really quick run, and this is some advice I give my clients when they come into the Shanghai. One thing you don't see a lot of in food production in China is openness and transparency, right? So you have to take it in good faith that things are being produced to a certain standard that you expect. What has a good and deep impression on consumers when they're in Australia, when they're fortunate enough to be here, is the fact you can go to a cellar door, or you can go on the food tour, or you can put on a hat and look there, and people are kind of amazed that, oh, this is so open and transparent and must be safe. So that's, I think, one practical thing that if it's not for every business, of course, and you might be in an industrial park out in the middle of nowhere where you're not going to expect anyone to come along, but there's nothing stopping you from doing, say, a flagship retail concept store or a pop-up, or just something that invites your customers in to experience it here, and you'll get sales, and that's how you can propel your brand a little bit.
Okay. Anybody else? I've got another question. If Andrew?
I kind of look at the real estate market actually as a good barometer of this in Melbourne. So friends of mine are trying to buy into Fitzroy, totally saturated. Looking at Collingwood, totally saturated. All the hot spots where people want to be. Auctions apparently full of mums and dads with bags of cash from China trying to buy property for their kids. So kind of what that tells me, and if you look at why Chinese consumers, particularly young Chinese consumers, are buying into our brands, is aspirational lifestyle. So where we've sort of moved from this highly functional kind of list of benefits for Australian brands that have worked so well for us, there is actually a high aspiration around certain elements of the Australian lifestyle, which I just talked about, right? The hyper-personalisation.
Yeah.
Individualism, freedom of expression
Yes.
for young people, to create, to develop new interesting communities. If you just look at what Chinese parents want for their kids, to go to the best school, to be around the coolest, interesting kids, to expand their mind, Some of the brands that have benefited particularly well in the functional milk space all have this big play around cognitive development. So I think that's kind of interesting to look at.
Functional foods is where it's
functional
at, right?
foods. Just look at sort of other industries and categories in Australia and what's happening with the Chinese consumer here as a bit of an early barometer about what role certain food brands could play for those future consumers. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think they want to access those lifestyles.
Okay, fantastic.
And that's the next subset of brands to come through for the consumer.
Very good.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to the next point in terms of market. So we are seeing a shift in the way that food safety is being regulated, enforced, managed in China. So that environment is not static anymore. We are seeing local brands, local product brands that are high quality, are directly competing with international brands. And there is growing trust amongst Chinese consumers to Chinese brands. In that context, how do Australian brands make trust a pillar? Now, we were talking about pillars. And Matt, can you refer to an example for this one? I'm thinking breakfast cereal.
So, sorry, what was...
About trust. How to build trust, Australian brand, consumer.
Yeah.
If you're happy to share that. If not, we can use some other examples.
Yeah, we may use some other examples.
Sure.
But look, at the end of the day, what does brand do for your product? Brand is a badge of trust. So what you really need to do is build that association with your brand. And I think, some of the things that Brent was talking about in terms of our transparency. There has been a lack of transparency, I would say, in the food production industry in China, and that is changing. In fact, recently I had a meeting with a large baby food manufacturer, a completely domestic business, and they've actually now put cameras inside their factory and facility, so that consumers and mothers who are, perhaps still not quite as trusting as they need to be in order to purchase.
Peace of mind, right?
It's giving them peace of mind.
Yep.
So it's really interesting, and a current sort of a theme that's been throughout this conversation is just the speed at which things change. So one thing that I've learned in my years in China is just the speed, not just the speed of change, but the speed of Chinese companies to adapt to that change and execute. And so I think that, Australian businesses need to be highly cognizant of that. I can tell you, China's speed is not going away. If anything, it's actually getting faster. The velocity is getting faster, and I think some of us up here are a bit scared as to, how we're going to continue to deal with that environment. But that's the reality. So, really, I think embracing the transparency that we have here in Australia and celebrating that. I find that a lot of Australian companies are quite shy in sharing how good they actually are and to build that trust. So I think being open and transparent is certainly a great start for brands and businesses in their communication.
Thank you, Matt. Anybody else, Andrew? And then we've got some other panellists who'd like to share as well.
I'm about to get the blunt spoon out again, but I know, cover your eyes. It's kind of boring, like we
trust.
Trust is an entry point for Australian brands. It just doesn't get anywhere.
Hygiene.
It's a hygiene factor, right?
Okay.
If you look at claims and ranks of claims for anyone who's done research, it's sort of just like the common entry point. And all foreign brands outside of Asia, more broadly, the Dutch will own trust, the Swedish will own trust, the New Zealanders, etc.
The Dutch are big in dairy.
Yeah, they're pretty trustful people, apparently.
Yes.
So my father says. But the point is, you've just got to put effort into it, right? And I think of two brands, and the Chinese brands, they've kind of conked out with their branding a bit. Brands that have been around there for a long time. White Rabbit, very old Chinese brand, make those little candies that get stuck in your teeth, pull your fillings out. You got Oreo, American brand that's become quite China-fied over the years. Run out of ideas. Now the big thing in China for local brands is using what Chinese consumers know about those brands as springboards into really relevant stuff, right? So a co-branding with Karl Lagerfeld to play into the fashion space, a co-branding with the Forbidden City because heritage is taking off. Nike's done that in their campaigns.
So tourism and Australian tourism
yeah,
and education
education
could be that trigger point.
I think education, lifestyle,
Yeah.
tourism, those
Right.
kind of things, right? Sort of exploratory lifestyle. So, yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Nick?
For me, you're right. Trust obviously is paramount to any brand to induce trial. But if we're talking about creating Australian brands and businesses to export to China, trust can come from lots of different places. Everyone talks about the Daigou market. Obviously, it's a critical component. But again, that will go through a life cycle where I can see key opinion leaders actually, because they're the ones with the relationship with the consumers, actually developing their own brands over time and actually cutting certain manufacturers out. But ranging in key Australian retailers, certification against the claims that you're making on your product, visibility about where your ingredients are actually sourced from. All of these things are just layers that actually build that trust over time. And I think where a lot of the domestic players have been very smart, and it was very clear in China Skinny presentation earlier, is that they're putting the ingredients in the right packaging formats to meet the right usage occasions for the local consumer. And at the end of the day, that's why they're out. Actually, the Chinese companies are buying a lot of assets because they want the supply. They'll do the marketing and putting it in the right formats, but they want that transparency and trust component, which they know, the Chinese consumer craves.
Okay, fantastic. Brent, last comment?
Yeah, I'd say trust is obviously there. It's a given. I think one thing that's probably too missing in Australian brands is the emphasis on status and prestige. Germans can do that very well for obvious reasons. The
Yes.
French do it for luxury clothes and they do it for wine. If you look at probably the two most successful Australian businesses, consumer goods businesses in China recently, would be Penfolds and A2. They have status in spades. That takes a long time.
I have heritage as well.
Correct. Now, heritage could mean anything. It's you've been on a family farm for 3 generations. Yep. There's things to do it. It doesn't happen overnight, and I think as we were saying before, one key takeaway from this should be this is a long-term play at this market, and you need to spend the time to get to that kind of level.
That's a really good point. A2 is a great example that they've obviously done incredibly well in China, but consumers give them permission to do other stuff.
Yep.
And they've done a lot of other stuff and really, really well. So I think that's the point. It just takes time to get there.
Very good. I'm just keeping an eye on our time. We do have 10 minutes for questions, so I'll make sure that we keep that. I'm going to ask a few final questions to kind of wrap up. And the first of those is, should brands that are here localise or not localise? If I can get a very prompt answer from a couple of you on that, should they be using the pillars established for Australia with some tweaking? How should brands be thinking about that?
I think for brands that aren't established and well known in China, I think that localization is too far advanced for them.
Okay.
I think once a brand is established and it's got a base business and has got some resonance with the consumer, I think then looking at a level of customization and localization is a good thing.
Okay. Anybody? Nick,
It
would
depends
you like
on
to
your
make a
route to
comment?
market.
Sorry?
It depends on your route to market.
Yes.
If you look at, if we're using A2 as an example, great success. If you look at where their volume is, they're Australian sales, which are actually sent overseas. So the demand and the consumer is China, but the sale, the territory of sale is Australia. So they're actually having to meet the Australian standard in the Australian format. And if you look across cross-border, everyone's selling the circa top 100 products. None of them are personalised for the market. If that evolves to therefore become an official so general trade into key accounts in China, that's a totally different step.
Andrew, do you want to make maybe a last comment on that one?
Size of prize. So unless you can put a number behind that specific question, then don't even think about it. So the more sophisticated brands, it doesn't have to cost the ends of the earth, will actually size the market. So when they come through innovation pipeline work or they've done their market exploratory work, they will be able to get to, working with agencies like us or other folks, to a number that says 33% of savvy Susans in Eastern China will buy this product as a locally branded product, and you can get peace of mind. You can get to a number. There's no one-size-fits-all answer on that.
Thank you. I see Brent's just taken the microphone. I'm going to ask Brent a question and then go back this way, if that's okay. For those, benchmarking is a really important thing to do. Who's doing it well? Why are they doing it well? May not necessarily be within the same segment. Brent, you deal with a lot of Australian brands. If you're going to leave with the people in the room today, our friends in the room today, a couple of Aussie brands that are doing it well, who would they be? And I might just quickly ask if anyone else has some comments as well, and then we'll go to our questions.
I'll leave the other panellists to give their observations on ones that are doing very well. The two I mentioned, I think they're very good examples to look at, but they're of a certain size. A comment I'd kind of make from my observations here over the last day is when you speak to a lot of the startups and people in the ag space, for example, they say they've put together a business plan. It's going to take 4 to 5 years. They bring in new capital. They're prepared to take a loss for a couple of years. They're very long-term and strategic about it. All the brands that are successful, the ones that we see, they've gone to the trouble of setting up an office in China.
Any examples, Brent, that you could share?
I'd say in our building we have Bellamy's Organic, for example.
Yep.
Now, I would hate to be doing investor relations for a publicly listed ASX business with a big part of your sales in China, because it can be a bit of a roller coaster.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, very important that you have operations there, or appoint someone, keep your eye on what's going on a regulations perspective, understand what the competition's doing. That's what successful companies do.
Any other that spring to mind?
Yeah, the couple that spring to mind for me, first would be Swiss, and I think the way that they've localised their messaging, and they've built the resources on the ground, and I guess since the investment came into that company, they're doing a great job. The other one, which is a little bit of an outlier that I see doing great stuff in China, is actually Bundaberg, the beverage company, and they've done a great job at building that brand, and they've just done some really great but simple activations. They've got a light box underneath the bottles that they put in bars and clubs, etc. And they've just created this great imagery. They've done a great job at targeting the female market that's out there in these places.
That's their predominant market.
Absolutely. And they're if you look at the size of the product, the packaging, the actual beverage itself, it doesn't tick a lot of those boxes that you would say this is going to be a winner in China. But I guess that the way that they've approached the market, they've got a great partner on the ground up there, and they're doing great things.
And they're a family-owned Queensland business, and they have had a long journey in market. Actually, Asialink Business did a case study on them a number of years ago, and you can go to asialinkbusiness.com.au and download that for free. Some really interesting insights as to their journey going back to 2015, and as you can tell, today they've really made strides. So we're now going to head on to our question and answer portion of today's session. No question is too small, no question is too complicated for us, I think.
Speak for yourself.
We have some good sharp panellists up here with some good experience. If you have a question, put up your hand. If I point to you, please, someone will come to you with a mic, mention your name, your company, your question, and who you're asking the question to. Because we only have 10 minutes, I may be kind of orchestrating up here, but please bear with me. So there's a gentleman here in the middle who has a question.
And we've got a couple
If you wouldn't mind standing up as well.
Nick, we've got a couple of
Hello.
questions through there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Helen.
Hello, I'm a Dutchman. Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
talking.
You must be trustworthy.
My name is
And I'll
My name
pass
is-
over to Helen.
my name is Diederik Brasser from Milkways. We've developed a specific technology, but I've got a more marketing question. Could you sell, let's say, Australian trust? I'm referring to milk, and bring that milk to China, and leave. So you have all the trust. It's like Intel inside, and leave the final marketing to the Chinese, the final branding, because there's trust inside, and they have better roads into China.
I think that I can answer that question both yes and no, and I think it really depends on your partner on the ground there. From my experience and what I've seen in a general sense, you need to be very careful in doing that. I think that to have your messaging right, to have your branding right, I think there needs to be a collaboration with the Chinese partner as opposed to just leaving everything to them.
Yeah, you've got, like a typical Dutchman, I'm sure you'll micromanage the hell out of it. You've got to be all over it. So any of our clients that have gone into a repackaging or repacking relationship have not done particularly well. So the narrative is usually taken back to head office to control. Someone mentioned before about marketing not being a particularly well-established industry in China. It's very knee-jerk. So there'll be a lot of knee-jerk, non-strategic sort of decisions made, a lot of activation decisions. So unless you have the time and the money and the resource to stay really on top of it, I would suggest no.
I'd also say it depends on the category of dairy that you're playing in. I mean, they're already doing it with infant formula at the end of the day, and they've changed regulations, highly regulated, reducing global competition. They've secured the best source of the ingredients, but they've also, government said, we want 60% of revenue in this category to come from domestic players. So I think the answer could be a maybe, but it depends on the segment of the category that you're playing in. But regardless, the management is, and the transparency and the right partner is absolutely critical.
Question from the audience, and I think this is one that when we see advertising of Chinese products, we see a lot, and that's the use of influencers, especially amongst social media. So we have a question about what value does sponsorship or seeking influencer promotion have on brand success in China? Is this something Australian companies should consider in the local market? Maybe, quick answers from your...
Sure. Look, absolutely. I think influencers play a very big role in China, as they do in Australia. Influencers using advertising here for a long, long time. What I would say is that the market has matured amazingly in the last couple of years. So, a couple of years back, see a lot of overseas companies essentially just pay big money and have what I would consider to have inappropriate KOLs supporting their brand in China, because it was purely, I need to have a KOL, so this person's really famous, so I'll just plonk them on my advertising and it'll work. And probably the worst example I've ever seen, and I apologise, I know that I've got some Kiwis here, but was the All Blacks. The All Blacks were actually used as joint KOLs for an infant formula brand, which just made absolutely no sense at all. It was just confusing and ridiculous. So I would say that with the right KOL, that has the right audience, because I think that reach of audience is absolutely critical when you're building a brand and a business in China. Yes, they can work and they can be very, very helpful and lucrative.
And Andrew, would you like
Just
to
on
add?
on that point, I mean, if you look at bang for buck, the good thing about doing marketing in China now versus, say, 5 years ago, lots of channels available. So if you have a very clever omni-channel approach, pop-up stores, you've got community retail, you may not have to go for a KOL. So a lot of the KOLs are being caught in scandals. I had a friend who runs a PR agency in Shanghai. KOL didn't show up at the final event, hijacked the event. So, they are not the golden goose to brand promotion. There are many, many other sort of marketing execution plays.
Cool. Nick, from the floor, perhaps, or is there any questions from the floor?
This gentleman
sorry,
down here.
gentleman down the front. Nearly didn't see that.
I get that a lot.
Sorry.
It's the height. First of all, thank you very much. That was brilliant, especially for someone like me who doesn't know very much about anything in China. Love your humour, by the way, and the thought of a spoon going through the eyes is something that I don't ever think I'll ever forget. Now, my question is this. So I should say, my name is John, and I'm the founder of the Ausmedican Group, which is a medicinal cannabis licensed healthcare company. And one of the divisions that we have out with our pharmaceutical division and education division is Hemp Oz. My question is, I take on board the green clean, and I agree that that would be standard. How does the Chinese consumer relate to or expect evidence-based companies or evidence-based products? So we're a medical company, but we also have hemp water, we have hemp kombucha, we have hemp seeds, we have hemp protein, we have all of that stuff, but it has to be backed by evidence. So it has to go through quite a rigorous process to get that evidence. Is that something that is interesting or not to the consumer in China?
Well, the first thing is you may not even be able to get your product into China because something like CBD and hemp may not even have what's called a GBH classification. Do you have that? You've got all that. You've got all that. A lot. I think anything that's in the pharma medicinal wellness space, they're looking for even more evidence of that. If you look at just e-com stores and you scroll through the pages, you're going to see certificates and endorsements and videos and trial results. They are pretty serious about that. And then they will go to the lengths to actually research that back in Australia. So that's the other thing. Like Chinese consumers, probably one of the most research-savvy consumers in the world because they've just been flogged with pretty crap products for a long time. So they are on the lookout for that. Yeah, we will. All right.
And I suggest you talk to Brent as well.
Great. Another question from the floor. What is the biggest mistake a brand can make when entering the China market? I'm going to put the panel to the test. I'd like them all to answer in one sentence. What is the biggest...
I can give you one word.
Can I start?
You can.
Break trust.
Wrong partner.
Push.
Organisation.
Homework.
That's 5 things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen.
It was quite awkward, wasn't it?
Questions from the floor before I go to the app?
I am being asked to wrap up in 1 second, Helen, so we might take the final
Yep, final question. Sure.
6 seconds. Final question. Fantastic.
Do you guys think that it's still necessary to be offline in Australia, or can an online brand, a successful online brand in Australia, be successful in China, or does it still need the offline component?
Do you want to answer that, Brent?
You need the offline component.
And if I can just add, it depends on your product, on your consumer.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to wrap up, if that's okay, and just make a few concluding remarks. Firstly, thank you for the great questions. Thank you for the great insights. And do your homework. Be smart. Realise that there are people, organisations out there to assist, and there is information out there to assist you. Leverage the Chinese diaspora within Melbourne, within your organisations, to give you insights as to what drives their thinking about what creates a good brand. That is really important. And there is no real substitute for going through that brand growth, going through that brand journey, as long as it may take, without going into market, without talking to the consumers without benchmarking and without reaching out to the Australian community, the local community, to really start to understand what are going to be the triggers that are going to create relevance for you to create a successful Australian brand in China. So if I can just finish on that note, and thank again, and let's give a round of applause to our panellists and to the great questions, to our fantastic MC Helen Brown, and I think I'll end on that note and hand over to Helen.